Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little trip, not to some exotic beach, but back in time. Imagine this, you wake up, sunlight, if you're lucky enough to have windows, streams faintly into your small, smoky hovel. Your stomach is already rumbling, a familiar, unwelcome companion. There's no fridge humming in the background, no pantry stocked with endless choices. In fact, there's no pantry at all. You sniff the air, hoping for the faint scent of something. Edible, anything. But mostly you get the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and perhaps a faint, lingering aroma of something that probably shouldn't be lingering. You swing your legs out of a bed that's likely little more than a sack, your muscles aching from a day of back-breaking labor. Because in this time, survival isn't just a concept, it's your full-time job. Your mind, even before your feet hit the cold, packed dirt floor, is already calculating. What scraps are left from yesterday? Is there enough to get through the morning? Will I have the energy to work the fields, or tend the animals, or spin the wool today? Because every calorie counts, every single one. You're not thinking about gourmet meals, or even satisfying meals. You're thinking about survival. And let me tell you, that's a constant, gnawing worry that permeates every single waking moment. Your modern, perfectly nourished body, sipping on that protein shake or munching on that organic granola bar right now, probably wouldn't last a week. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to see us all connecting across different corners of the globe now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stumble out into the pre-dawn chill, the air thick with the promise of another grueling day. Your neighbor, a woman whose face is etched with lines that speak of endless toil and too little food, offers a weak smile as she too begins her morning ritual, preparing what meager sustenance she has. For most people, during the vast stretch of time we call the Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, life was a relentless, often losing, battle against hunger. Forget the lavish banquets you see in movies, filled with roasted swans and overflowing goblets. That was, for 99% of the population, a fantasy as distant as the moon. For you, the peasant, the farmer, the everyday person, food didn't just suck. It was often scarce, monotonous, and frequently unsafe. Think about your daily intake. You're not getting 5 a day, or even 3 square meals. You're getting enough to keep you from literally dropping dead, and sometimes not even that. Your diet is dominated by grains, primarily whatever can be grown locally and cheaply. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. These are the foundations of your existence, and not the finely milled, bleached flour you're used to. Oh no. We're talking coarse, gritty stuff, often filled with bits of chaff, tiny stones, and sometimes, if you're truly unlucky, fungal spores that can make you terribly, terribly ill. Ergot poisoning, for instance, caused by a fungus that grows on rye, could lead to convulsions, hallucinations, and even death. It's theorized that outbreaks of what was known as St. Anthony's fire might have been ergotism. A chilling reminder that your daily bread could literally be your demise. The idea of a varied diet is, frankly, laughable. You eat what you grow, or what your Lord allows you to grow, or what you can forage without getting caught. Meat is a luxury, an occasional treat at best, and often restricted by hunting laws that favor the nobility. Vegetables are mostly root, vegetables or hardy greens that can survive harsh winters, often cooked into bland porridges or stews. Fruits are seasonal, highly perishable, and not always considered safe to eat raw. And while honey is around, refined sugar is still centuries away from widespread use, so your sweet tooth goes mostly unsatisfied, unless you're lucky enough to raid a wild beehive and not get stung into next week. Water, the universal thirst quencher you take for granted, is often unsafe to drink. No elaborate filtration systems, no municipal water treatment plants. You're relying on wells, rivers, or rain collection, all of which are susceptible to contamination from human and animal waste. This is a time when people lived in close quarters with their livestock, and sanitation was more of a hopeful concept than a practiced reality. So, what do you drink? You drink ale and mead, fermented beverages, often low in alcohol content, were a safer alternative because the fermentation process helped kill off some of the nasty bacteria. You drink it all day long, even the children. Imagine waking up and your first sip is a warm, slightly cloudy, weak beer. Sounds like a party, right? Well, it was less about getting tipsy and more about avoiding dysentery. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the direct link between contaminated water and disease, or if they simply learned through trial and error that fermented drinks were less likely to make them violently ill. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a pragmatic solution born of necessity. This constant struggle for food, this battle against malnutrition and hunger, shaped every aspect of medieval life. It dictated your daily routine, influenced social structures, fueled conflicts, and even shaped religious practices like fasting. The threat of famine was a dark cloud perpetually hanging over every community, a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability to the whims of nature and the limitations of their technology. You're living in a time when a bad harvest means widespread starvation, not just higher grocery bills. Your life, your health, your very existence hinged on the success of that year's crops. It's a level of dependency that we, in our climate-controlled, abundance-filled world, can barely fathom. You exist in a food system that is fragile, precarious, and often deadly. So, when we talk about food sucking in medieval times, we're not just talking about bland flavors or lack of variety. We're talking about a fundamental, existential struggle. As your journey continues through this fascinating, if slightly grim, culinary landscape, let's talk about the absolute, undisputed champion of the medieval plate, bread. You might imagine fluffy baguettes or artisanal sourdough, but that's not what we're dealing with here. For you, the vast majority of the population, bread wasn't just a food. It was the food. It was your energy source, your filler, your nutrient delivery system, and often the only thing you ate from dawn till dusk. We're talking about a kind of bread that would make your modern, gluten-free, carb-conscious self weep. Your bread was likely dark, dense, and incredibly coarse. It was made from whatever grains were most readily available and cheapest in your region, typically rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, while desirable, was often a luxury crop reserved for the nobility or for special occasions. Even when wheat was used, it was rarely the finely sifted, white flour you know. Mills were rudimentary, powered by water or wind, and weren't particularly efficient at separating the bran and germ from the endosperm. So, your daily loaf was a whole grain affair, whether you liked it or not, packed with fiber, yes, but also a texture that would feel like chewing on sandpaper. Imagine trying to make a nice, soft sandwich with that. You'd probably break a tooth. The quality of this bread was highly variable, depending on the harvest. If it was a good year, you might get something vaguely palatable. If it was a bad year, well, things got really interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. In times of scarcity, people would stretch their meager grain supplies by mixing in all sorts of fillers. This could include pea flour, bean flour, or even less appetizing things like ground acorns, sawdust, or even dried ground roots. Yes, you heard that right, sawdust. It sounds like a joke, but when you're literally staring starvation in the face, a bit of tree dust starts to look like a viable option to bulk up your meager meal. Historians still argue whether the practice of adding non-food items was widespread or confined to the most desperate periods of famine. But evidence from archaeological digs sometimes reveals strange, non-grain particles in ancient bread remains. Makes you appreciate your local bakery, doesn't it? The process of making this bread was arduous. First, the grain had to be threshed to separate it from the stalks, then winnowed to remove the chaff. Then, and this was the truly back-breaking part, it had to be ground. If you were lucky, there was a communal mill. If not, you were grinding it by hand with a quern, a stone hand mill, a task that demanded incredible strength and endurance. Then, the flour was mixed with water, and perhaps a sourdough starter commercial yeast was still centuries away, kneaded and then baked. Ovens were often communal, or if you were wealthy, you might have your own. The fuel was usually wood, and temperature control was more of an art form, or perhaps a prayer, than a science. This meant your bread could be burnt on the outside, doughy on the inside, or just a solid, rock-hard lump. This bread was eaten with almost every meal, often acting as a sort of edible plate or trencher. You'd pile your meager stew or vegetables on a thick slice of stale bread, eating the food, and then, if you were still hungry, eating the gravy-soaked bread itself. It was the ultimate multi-purpose utensil and food item. It also formed the basis of many common dishes, like pottage, a thick porridge or stew made from grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available, often cooked for hours over an open fire. Imagine you've been working in the fields all day, sun beating down, muscles screaming, and you come home to a bowl of greyish, lumpy pottage, scooped out onto a piece of rock-hard, dark bread. It might not sound like a Michelin star experience, but in a world where hunger was a constant companion, it was sustenance, and that was all that truly mattered. Even the freshness of bread was a luxury. Most people ate bread that was days old, hard and stale. This wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. Baking was time-consuming and fuel-intensive, so it wasn't done daily in most households. Stale bread was simply a fact of life, often softened with water or dipped into whatever liquid was available. Often your daily ale, remember. So, you're not just eating a heavy, gritty bread, you're eating a heavy, gritty, stale bread. And if you think that sounds unappealing, well, you're right. But it was often the difference between feeling something in your stomach and feeling the agonizing pangs of true hunger. The idea of tossing out old bread, unthinkable, every crumb, was precious, every morsel a victory. This wasn't about culinary delight. It was about sheer, brute force survival. So, you've got your dense, gritty bread, the cornerstone of your medieval diet. Now, what do you put on it? Or, more accurately, what do you dream of putting on it? For most of you, meat was less a dietary staple and more a mythical beast, seen perhaps once or twice a year, if you were lucky. Forget your modern notion of a juicy steak or a perfectly roasted chicken on a Tuesday night. In medieval times, meat was a symbol of status, power, and and wealth, far more than just a source of protein. If you were a peasant, living out in the countryside, your access to meat was incredibly restricted. Most of the land and the wild game on it belonged to the lord of the manor. Hunting was largely forbidden to commoners, often punishable by severe fines, mutilation, or even death. Imagine being desperately hungry, seeing a plump deer or a flock of wild fowl just out of reach, knowing that even thinking about snaring it could cost you your hand or your life. It's a frustrating reality that underlines the vast social inequalities of the era. This mainstream historical fact about poaching laws vividly illustrates the control the elite held over food resources. So where did the ordinary person get their meat? Sometimes, if you were fortunate, your lord might throw a feast and distribute some scraps, or perhaps allow a communal hunting day for small game, though this was rare. More often, your meat came from animals you raised yourself, if you were allowed to keep them, or from the less desirable parts of animals that died naturally. Think about it: a sheep that died of old age or illness, or a pig that succumbed to disease that was your meat for the week, if you could even call it that. And remember, no refrigeration. So, if you got a carcass, you had to eat it fast, or salt it, or smoke it, hoping it wouldn't go rancid before you finished it. This led to a lot of reliance on salted or dried meats, which, while preserving them, often made them incredibly tough, chewy, and, well, really salty. You'd need gallons of that weak ale to wash it down. Pork was probably the most common domestic meat, as pigs could be raised on scraps and didn't require much pasture. If you owned a pig, that was a significant asset. A pig provided not just meat, but also valuable fat lard, which was crucial for cooking and energy. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, pigs were allowed to roam freely, even in towns, acting as nature's garbage disposals, gobbling up refuse. While efficient, it also meant your future bacon might have had a very varied diet. Poultry, like chickens and geese, were also kept, primarily for their eggs, but also for meat on special occasions. If you had a chicken, you probably cherished it for its daily egg rather than its potential as a Sunday roast. Chickens were a bit like medieval ATMs, providing regular small withdrawals of protein and fishing. If you lived near a river or the coast, fish could supplement your diet, especially during the numerous fasting days dictated by the church, when meat consumption was forbidden. But even then, fish wasn't always plentiful, and preserving it for any length of time was a challenge. Beef was the true luxury. Cattle required significant pasture land and were primarily valued for their labor, plowing fields, and their milk, not their meat. Slaughtering a cow was a massive undertaking, typically reserved for large estates or for feeding armies. If you, as a common person, ever got a taste of beef, it was likely tough, stringy, and certainly not the marbled, tender cuts you find in a supermarket today. Historians still argue whether medieval cattle were primarily kept for draft purposes, and milk, with meat being a secondary, opportunistic byproduct, or if some regions actively managed herds for meat production. It's a chicken and egg, or rather, candomplou question for academics. Even when meat was consumed, the approach was very different. Every single part of the animal was used: the entrails, the blood, the organs. Nothing was wasted. Dishes like blood sausage or haggis-like puddings were common, not out of culinary adventurousness, but out of absolute necessity. You couldn't afford to throw anything away. This nose-to-tail eating was simply a practical reality, ensuring maximum caloric and nutritional return from a precious resource. So, while you might find the idea of eating intestines a bit squeamish, for your medieval counterpart, it was just another meal, another way to stave off hunger. It reminds you that necessity really is the mother of all less appealing recipes. All right, so you've got your sturdy bread, and you're still dreaming of meat, which, let's be honest, you're probably not getting today. What about something fresh, something green, something to break up the monotony? Well, buckle up, because the world of vegetables in medieval times was, for the most part, far less exciting and diverse than your supermarket produce aisle. When we talk about medieval vegetables, we're largely talking about humble, hardy, and often rather bland root vegetables and some basic greens. For most common folk, vegetables were grown in small garden plots or gathered from the wild. They weren't the stars of the show. They were typically fillers, additions to the ever-present pottage, or simply sustenance to get you through. The variety you had access to depended heavily on your region, the climate, and the season. Forget about year-round broccoli or exotic bell peppers. We're talking about things that could survive harsh winters and provide calories when other food sources were scarce. The champions of the medieval vegetable patch were undoubtedly cabbage, onions, leeks, garlic, and root vegetables. Like carrots, though often purple or white, not the bright orange you know, parsnips and turnips. Peas and beans were also incredibly important, not just as vegetables, but as crucial sources of protein, especially on those numerous meat-free fasting days. Lentils were also common. These legumes were dried and stored, forming a vital part of the winter diet. Imagine a world where your main vegetable options are various forms of boiled root or brassica. It's not exactly a culinary adventure, is it? Many of these vegetables, especially root vegetables, were often boiled for long periods in stews or porridges, sometimes to the point of losing much of their texture and a good deal of their nutritional value, at least by modern standards. But the goal wasn't crunch or vibrant color, it was digestibility and bulk. You wanted something that would fill your stomach and give you some energy, even if it meant a mushy texture and a somewhat muted flavor. A quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes actually called for boiling vegetables with meat if you had it for hours, not just to cook them, but to extract every last bit of flavor and nutrient, creating a sort of primordial stock or broth. It was slow cooking taken to an extreme. Wild greens and foraged plants also played a significant role, especially for those with less land or during leaner times. Things like nettles, dandelions, wild garlic, and various edible weeds provided vitamins and minerals that might otherwise be missing from a grain-heavy diet. But foraging required knowledge, knowing what was safe to eat and what was poisonous in time, which was often in short supply for the working poor. Plus, you couldn't rely on it as a primary food source, just a supplement. The concept of a salad, as we know it, with crisp, raw greens, was largely absent from the common person's diet. Raw vegetables were often viewed with suspicion, partly due to concerns about cleanliness, and partly because cooking was seen as a way to tame wild flavors and make food more digestible. This is a practice that lingered in many cuisines for centuries. Even today, some traditional European dishes involve long-cooked vegetables that might seem overcooked to a modern palate. Historians still argue whether the aversion to raw vegetables was primarily due to legitimate health concerns related to sanitation, or simply a culinary preference born from the limitations of the time. It's hard to say definitively if it was fear of germs, or just a love for mush. So your vegetable intake was limited, often bland and cooked to oblivion. While modern nutritionists scream about the importance of fresh, vibrant vegetables, your medieval counterpart was just happy to have anything green that didn't immediately kill them. You certainly wouldn't be Instagramming your dinner unless you wanted to start a trend called #GrayandMushyLife. And honestly, after a day of back-breaking labor, the comforting warmth of a thick, if unexciting, vegetable pottage was probably a welcome relief, even if it did taste a bit like boiled earth. You've nibbled on your bland vegetables, choked down your dense bread, and dreamt of a fleeting bite of meat. Now, let's consider something that, for your modern self, screams healthy snack or dessert: fruits. In medieval times, fresh fruit was a tricky proposition. It wasn't the readily available, perfectly ripe, and hygienically packaged commodity you grab from your local grocery store. For you, the common person, fresh fruit was seasonal, often risky, and certainly not something you could rely on for daily nutrition. Most fruits were strictly seasonal, meaning you only had them for a brief window during the year. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, and various berries were the most common. Imagine waiting an entire year for your favorite fruit to be in season, only to find that half the harvest was ruined by bad weather or pests. No imported Chilean grapes. In January for you, when fruits were available, they were often consumed quickly, straight from the tree or bush, before they spoiled. And spoiling was a major concern. Without refrigeration, fruits had an incredibly short shelf life. They would bruise, rot, and attract insects almost immediately. This meant that if you were lucky enough to get your hands on some fresh fruit, you had to eat it then and there, or find a way to preserve it. Preservation methods were rudimentary: drying, making jams or compotes often sweetened with precious honey, or fermenting them into ciders or perries. A mainstream historical fact is that apples and pears were often pressed into cider, not just as a drink, but as a way to preserve their caloric value beyond their short, fresh season. This was especially true in regions where grapes for wine were not readily available. The idea of raw fruit was also viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. Similar to raw vegetables, there was a prevalent belief that raw fruits and vegetables could cause illness or upset the humors of the body. While we understand this now to be largely related to poor sanitation and the presence of bacteria on unwashed produce, in medieval times it was simply an accepted truth. So, even if you had access to fresh fruit, you might be encouraged to cook it, thereby losing some of its freshness and nutritional punch. Think about it. A cooked apple is nice, but it's not the crisp, juicy delight of a fresh one. This meant that the limited times you did get fruit, it might be in a mushy, stewed form, rather than a vibrant raw treat. Foraging for wild berries and nuts was another way to supplement the diet, especially for the very poor. Blackberries, raspberries, sloes, hazelnuts, and walnuts could be found in forests and hedgerows. But this again required time, knowledge of safe foraging, and venturing into areas that might be controlled by a lord or dangerous due to wild animals. It also meant competing with other hungry people and local wildlife. It was a risky, often meager venture. A quirky tidbit: citrus fruits, like lemons and oranges, were known in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean regions, but they were incredibly rare and expensive imports, almost exclusively consumed by the very wealthy as a luxury or for medicinal purposes. The idea of adding A lemon slice to your water or squeezing orange juice for breakfast was an alien concept. If you saw an orange, it would be akin to seeing a unicorn, a magical exotic item, certainly not for everyday consumption. Historians still argue whether the medieval dietary aversion to raw fruits and vegetables was a rational response to genuinely unsafe food handling practices, or if it was more deeply rooted in ancient medical theories about hot and cold foods and their impact on health. It's a bit of both, likely. But for you, the consequence was the same. Fresh, uncooked fruit was a rare, often discouraged, and frequently dangerous indulgence. So, while you might gaze longingly at a vibrant red apple, you'd probably be urged to cook it into a bland sauce, just to be safe. It definitely took the shine off the apple, a day advice. So, your medieval palate is already pretty subdued from the bread, scarce meat, and cooked Judith vegetables and fruits. Now, let's wade into the world of dairy, a seemingly simple food group that, in medieval times, was fraught with its own set of challenges and dangers. While cows, goats, and sheep were present, getting their milk from udder to table in a safe, palatable form was a whole different story than grabbing a carton from your refrigerated case. For starters, fresh milk was almost certainly not something you drank regularly, if at all. Remember the lack of refrigeration. Milk spoils incredibly quickly, especially in warmer climates. Without pasteurization, a process centuries away from being invented, milk was also a prime carrier of bacteria. Drinking raw, unchilled milk from an animal that might not be in the cleanest conditions was essentially playing Russian roulette with your digestive system. While children might have had access to fresh milk from a family cow or goat, adults largely avoided it due to its perishability and the risk of illness. Imagine that. Milk, the universal symbol of nourishment, was often too dangerous to drink. It's a mainstream historical fact that widespread consumption of fresh milk only became safe and common after the advent of pasteurization in the 19th century. So, if you couldn't drink fresh milk, how did people consume dairy? The answer lies in fermentation and processing. The primary forms of dairy in the medieval diet were cheese and butter. These products, through the processes of curdling, pressing, and salting for cheese or churning for butter, became much more stable and safer to store. Cheese, in particular, was a vital source of protein and fat, especially during the numerous fasting days when meat was forbidden. It could be aged, allowing it to last for months, if not longer, and its varying textures and flavors provided a small but welcome diversity to the monotonous diet. The cheese you'd encounter would range from fresh, soft curds to hard-aged cheeses, similar in concept to some modern artisan cheeses, though likely much cruder in production. Every region would have its own specific types of cheese, made from cow, goat, or sheep milk. Butter was also made, primarily in cooler climates, where it was easier to preserve, usually by salting heavily. It was a valuable source of fat and calories used in cooking and as a spread. Think about your breakfast this morning. Did it involve cheese or butter? Probably. But you probably didn't have to worry if it was going to make you terribly ill. A quirky tidbit: the churn, the device used to make butter, was often a wooden barrel or a pottery vessel, and making butter was a labor-intensive process that could take hours of continuous churning. This wasn't just a kitchen chore. It was a physical workout, and often done by the women of the household. Imagine spending your morning vigorously shaking a wooden barrel just to get a lump of salty butter. It makes getting your butter from the refrigerated section seem incredibly convenient, doesn't it? The safety of these dairy products, even in their processed forms, was still variable. Without strict quality control, you never quite knew what you were getting. Milk could be from diseased animals, or the processing could be unsanitary. Mold was common, and while some molds are desirable in cheese, others were not. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of foodborne illnesses in medieval times, often attributed to tainted meat or water, was significantly exacerbated by the consumption of improperly handled dairy products. It's tough to say how many tummy aches, or worse, were due to a bad batch of cheese versus a contaminated well. So, while dairy provided essential nutrients and calories, it was a delicate balance. You relied on cheese and butter for fat and protein, but you also had to trust that the process had made them safe enough to consume. It was a calculated risk, another daily gamble in the high-stakes game of medieval survival. Your taste buds might not be thrilled by the thought of warm, slightly funky cheese or heavily salted butter, but your medieval self would be grateful for the energy it provided. You've navigated the tricky waters of medieval dairy, clinging to cheese and butter for dear life. Now, let's talk about something that might seem counterintuitive when we discuss food sucking: spices. Today, spices are all about flavor, adding zing and complexity to your dishes. In medieval times, while flavor was a part of it, spices were far more about demonstrating your wealth, masking unpleasantries, and to a lesser extent, preservation. For you, the common person, spices were largely a fantasy, something you heard tales about from distant lands, but rarely, if ever, tasted. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger came from incredibly far-off places: India, Indonesia, China, traveling vast distances along arduous trade routes like the Silk Road. This long journey, coupled with the dangers of piracy, overland bandits, and multiple middlemen, made them astronomically expensive. They were literally worth their weight in gold, or sometimes even more. A mainstream historical fact is that Venice and Genoa, Italian maritime republics, grew immensely wealthy by controlling much of the European spice trade during the Middle Ages, effectively acting as the gatekeepers to these precious commodities. Imagine entire empires being built on the control of a few dried berries or tree barks. So, if you were a wealthy lord or a high-ranking cleric, your table might indeed be laden with highly spiced dishes, a blatant display of your immense status. Serving heavily spiced food was a way to show off your economic power, to declare, "Look how rich I am. I can afford to sprinkle expensive dust from the other side of the world on my food." It wasn't just about taste, it was about conspicuous consumption on a grand scale. You might think, oh, they just used spices to cover up rotten meat. And while that's a popular myth, it's not entirely accurate. While spices could certainly mask the odor of slightly off food, they wouldn't eliminate the bacteria or the risk of illness. No amount of pepper could magically make truly putrid meat safe to eat. Nor would anyone willingly consume rotten food when good food was available, no matter how much they paid for the spices. However, spices did play a role in preservation, albeit a limited one. Salt was the primary preservative, but some spices, particularly those with antimicrobial properties like cloves or cinnamon, could slightly extend the shelf life of certain foods, or more effectively, prevent insect infestations in stored grains or dried meats. Think of it less as a miracle cure for spoilage and more as a small, expensive deterrent for pests. For you, the common medieval person, your spices were much more humble. You relied on locally grown herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, and savory to add flavor to your bland pottages and stews. These herbs were easily cultivated in your small garden plot or foraged from the wild. They provided much-needed flavor, vitamins, and sometimes even medicinal properties. This reliance on local herbs is a quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked when people focus solely on the exotic spices of the rich. While the Lord dined on spiced venison, you were making do with a stew flavored with wild thyme and a lot of vengeful thinking. Historians still argue whether the medieval preference for heavily spiced food among the elite was primarily driven by status display, genuine culinary preference for strong flavors, or a lingering belief in their medicinal properties, as many spices were also used in medieval medicine. It's probably a cocktail of all three, but the bottom line for you was that if your food tasted like anything more than boiled turnips, it was a rare and special day. So, while you're unwinding, sipping your drink, maybe appreciating the subtle nuances of a finely spiced dish you had for dinner, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart, whose spices were often just a vigorous sprinkle of, well, nothing much at all. Section 8. You've resigned yourself to unspiced, often bland, meals. But what about that primal human craving for sweetness? In your modern life, sugar is ubiquitous, an inexpensive staple found in everything from your morning coffee to your favorite snack. In medieval times, satisfying that sweet tooth was an entirely different and far more challenging proposition. For you, the common person, honey reigned supreme as the primary and often only available sweetener. Refined cane sugar, as we know it, was incredibly rare and astronomically expensive throughout most of the Middle Ages in Europe. It had to be imported from distant lands, largely from the Middle East and later from new sugarcane plantations in the Mediterranean. Like spices, it was a luxury item, a prized commodity consumed almost exclusively by the extremely wealthy, used sparingly in very special dishes, or reserved for medicinal purposes. Imagine sugar being something you'd lock away in a chest, not keep in a bowl on your counter. A mainstream historical fact is that sugar was so valuable that it was often kept in apothecaries and sold by weight alongside other precious drugs, rather than in a grocer's shop. It was literally seen as a kind of medicine or a rare luxury, not a foodstuff. So, if you wanted something sweet, your go-to was honey. Honey was produced locally from beehives, both wild and cultivated. Keeping bees was a common practice, and beekeeping provided not only honey but also beeswax, which was used for candles and other purposes. Honey's availability, of course, depended on the success of the local bee population and the skill of the beekeeper. If a particular year had a poor bee season, honey could become scarcer and more expensive even locally. Honey was used to sweeten drinks, porridges, and some rare sweet dishes. If you were lucky enough to have fruit, it might be stewed with honey to make a compote. Honey was also a crucial ingredient in mead, the fermented honey wine that was a popular alcoholic beverage. It provided a rich, earthy sweetness, but it wasn't the pure, crystalline sweetness you're accustomed to from refined sugar. It had its own distinct flavor profile, which you either loved or learned to tolerate. Beyond honey, what other options did you have for sweetness? Not many. You might occasionally find natural sweetness from very ripe fruits if you were lucky enough to get them. Dates, imported from the Middle East, were another sweet luxury, again only available to the wealthy. And some root vegetables, like parsnips, could develop a subtle sweetness when cooked. But the idea of a dessert course filled with cakes, cookies, and sugary confections was a world away for the common medieval person. Your dessert was often just a handful of dried fruit, if you were fortunate, or perhaps just another piece of that dense bread. A quirky tidbit: the process of harvesting honey in medieval times was often far more brutal for the bees than modern methods. Beekeepers sometimes had to destroy parts of the hive, or even the whole hive, to get at the honeycombs. This made beekeeping a somewhat seasonal and destructive practice, contrasting sharply with more sustainable methods developed later. Imagine the sticky, buzzing chaos of a medieval honey harvest, with angry bees everywhere and the constant threat of stings. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart. Historians still argue whether the limited availability of sugar influenced medieval culinary preferences for savory and tart flavors, or if it simply meant that the concept of sweet was inherently linked to the taste of honey and naturally sweet fruits. It's hard to imagine a world where you never taste the pure, unadulterated sweetness of sugar. But for you, living in medieval times, that was your reality. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe you'll appreciate that sugary snack a little bit more, knowing that for your medieval counterpart, even a tiny taste of pure sweetness was an almost unheard of luxury. Having explored the limited options for sweetness, let's move on to something even more fundamental: what you drank. Forget about sparkling water, soda, juice, or even a nice, clean glass of tap water. In medieval times, your liquid intake was dominated by ale and mead, not because people were constantly looking to party, but because these fermented beverages were often the safest and most reliable options for hydration. As we touched upon earlier, water was incredibly risky. There were no purification systems, no understanding of microscopic pathogens, and human and animal waste often contaminated rivers, streams, and shallow wells. Drinking untreated water was a direct invitation to dysentery, cholera, and a host of other debilitating and often fatal diseases. While some efforts might have been made to dig deeper wells or collect rainwater, the sheer volume of waste from a densely populated, unsanitized settlement meant that truly clean water was a rare commodity. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval cities, even those with access to rivers, suffered terribly from waterborne diseases, leading to high mortality rates, especially among children. This constant threat meant that people actively sought alternatives. Enter ale. This was the ubiquitous drink of the common people, consumed by men, women, and even children from morning till night. Medieval ale was not the strong, hopped beer you might imagine today. It was typically a low-alcohol beverage, often unfiltered and cloudy, made from barley, oats, or other grains. The brewing process involved boiling the water during mashing, which, crucially, killed most of the harmful bacteria. This made ale a far safer drink than raw water. Imagine waking up and having a pint of thin, warm ale with your bread for breakfast. It sounds strange to our modern sensibilities, but it was just a normal part of life. People weren't necessarily getting drunk all day. The alcohol content was often so low that it served primarily as a safe source of hydration and some calories. It was more akin to a liquid meal than an intoxicating beverage. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was another popular choice, particularly in regions where honey was plentiful. It could vary widely in strength and sweetness, but like ale, the fermentation process rendered it safer to drink than plain water. For the wealthier classes, wine was a highly prized beverage. It was produced in wine-growing regions like France and Italy, and imported elsewhere, making it significantly more expensive than ale or mead. Fine wines were a sign of status, and often diluted with water, another sign of wealth, as you could afford to waste some of the precious wine by watering it down, or spiced. The consumption of these fermented drinks was constant. You'd drink them with every meal, during work breaks, and throughout the day. It was simply how you stayed hydrated. The idea of reaching for a bottle of pure, tasteless water would have been baffling, if not dangerous. A quirky tidbit is that children were given small beer or small ale, which had an even lower alcohol content than the adult versions. It was still safer than the local well water, and provided calories and hydration necessary for their growth, even if it meant a lifetime of knowing only the taste of mild, fermented grain water. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of low-alcohol beverages contributed to a general state of mild intoxication in the medieval population, or if the tolerance levels were simply so high that it didn't significantly impair daily functioning. It's a fascinating debate. Were your medieval ancestors just perpetually a little buzzed? Either way, for you, it meant that your drink choices were limited, often warm, and certainly not designed for refreshing crispness. So, as you sip on your perfectly chilled drink tonight, imagine trading it for a murky, room temperature ale, knowing it's your best bet for avoiding a nasty stomach bug. Cheers, or rather, health. You've just taken your last imaginary sip of slightly too warm ale. Now, let's delve into another significant aspect that shaped your medieval diet. Not by what was available, but by what was forbidden: fasting. For you, living in medieval times, food wasn't just about sustenance. It was deeply intertwined with religious observance, and the dictates of the church held immense power over what and when you ate. Fasting wasn't a trendy diet or a personal choice. It was a non-negotiable, mainstream historical fact of life, and it meant going without certain foods for significant periods. The medieval church mandated numerous days of abstinence and fasting throughout the year. The most prominent of these was Lent, a 40-day period leading up to Easter, during which meat, eggs, and dairy products were forbidden. Imagine giving up all your limited sources of protein and fat for over a month, but Lent was just the beginning. There were also fast days every Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, as well as the eves of major feast days. In total, it's estimated that medieval Christians might have observed 100 to 150 fast days in a year. That's a huge portion of your calendar where your already limited diet became even more restrictive. On these fast days, the general rule was no flesh, meaning no red meat or poultry. Fish was permitted, which is why fish became such an important food source, especially for coastal communities or those near rivers. But even fish wasn't always accessible for everyone, especially for inland peasants far from water sources. So, for many, a fast day meant a diet consisting primarily of bread, vegetables, often boiled peas or beans, and perhaps some pottage made with grains and water. Imagine the monotony, your already limited options becoming even more limited for half the year. It sounds less like spiritual reflection and more like an organized exercise in perpetual hunger. These fasting rules weren't just suggestions. They were rigorously enforced by the church. Violating them could lead to penance, public shaming, or even excommunication. The idea was to mortify the flesh, to practice self-denial and spiritual discipline. But for the vast majority of the population, who are already living on the brink of subsistence, these periods of fasting pushed them even closer to malnutrition and genuine hunger. It was one thing for a wealthy lord to fast, replacing meat with expensive imported fish. It was quite another for a peasant to subsist on little more than watery gruel and stale bread. A quirky tidbit is how creative people became in interpreting no flesh. Some definitions of flesh were quite literal, meaning anything that came from a land animal. This led to certain aquatic animals being declared fish for fasting purposes, even if they were biologically mammals or birds. Beavers, for instance, with their scaly tails and aquatic habitat, were sometimes considered fish, and certain waterfowl, like puffins or barnacle geese, which spent a lot of time in water, were also sometimes controversially consumed on fast days. It's a testament to human ingenuity and perhaps desperation. In bending the rules for a meal, historians still argue whether the Church's fasting mandates, while spiritually motivated, inadvertently served a practical purpose by forcing a more balanced, albeit unappetizing, diet at certain times, or if they primarily contributed to widespread malnutrition. It's a complex debate, but for you, it meant your already tough food situation was made even harder by religious obligation. So, as you consider what you'll have for your next meal, perhaps with a side of delicious, juicy meat, remember your medieval counterpart, looking at their plate of plain beans, waiting for the long fast to finally end. Having endured the endless fast days and their restrictive diets, let's now pivot to the polar opposite, a spectacle so rare and magnificent, it would be etched into your memory for years: feasts. For the vast majority of you, the common folk, a medieval feast was an almost unimaginable indulgence, a fleeting glimpse into a world of abundance and excess that stood in stark contrast to your daily struggle for survival. These were not casual dinners, they were carefully orchestrated displays of wealth, power, and generosity, usually hosted by kings, nobles, or high-ranking clergy. Imagine yourself, perhaps as a servant or a fortunate spectator on the fringes, witnessing such an event. The hall, usually a grand castle keep or a monastery refectory, would be ablaze with candlelight and roaring fires, a welcome change from your smoky hovel. The air would be thick with unfamiliar aromas, roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries, a sensory overload after a lifetime of bland pottage. Long tables would groan under the weight of an incredible array of dishes. This was a mainstream historical fact. Medieval feasts were designed to impress, to solidify social bonds, and to demonstrate the host's immense resources and generosity. What would you see? Rivers of wine and ale, served in ornate goblets, mountains of white bread, a true luxury for those accustomed to dark, gritty loaves. And then, the main event, meat. Lots of it. Roasted boars, venison, swans, peacocks often, redressed in their feathers after cooking for dramatic effect, geese, chickens, and various small game. The sheer quantity alone would be breathtaking. This was a world away from your rare, stringy morsels of salted pork. Dishes would be heavily spiced, showcasing the host's ability to afford precious, imported commodities. Imagine the rich, complex flavors, a symphony for a palate accustomed to monotony. Beyond the sheer volume of food, medieval feasts also featured elaborate culinary artistry. Cooks, despite primitive tools, created astounding dishes. A quirky tidbit is the subtlety, an edible centerpiece made from molded, dyed sugar paste, marzipan, or even sculpted butter, depicting allegorical scenes, coats of arms, or fantastical creatures. These weren't meant to be eaten, or at least not entirely, but to entertain and impress. Much like a modern ice sculpture or elaborate cake, imagine a sugar castle, complete with tiny edible knights, gracing the center of the table. It was pure edible theater. Of course, these feasts weren't just about eating. They were social events, often accompanied by entertainment, minstrels, jesters, acrobats, and even moral plays. The dining was often boisterous. With diners eating with their hands, forks were still a rare novelty for much of the period. Throwing bones to the dogs under the tables, and generally indulging in a sensory-free. For the ordinary person, such a sight would be both mesmerizing and perhaps a little heartbreaking. A stark reminder of the vast chasm between your reality and the lives of the elite. Historians still argue whether the apparent gluttony of medieval feasts was a genuine reflection of constant overindulgence among the rich, or if these lavish displays were primarily strategic, calculated performances designed to project power and reinforce social hierarchies. It's likely a bit of both, a chance to eat well for those who could afford it, but also a crucial part of political and social maneuvering. So, while you might witness the incredible spectacle of a medieval feast, remember it was a brief, tantalizing dream in a life of often harsh culinary reality. And as you imagine the rich smells and sounds, perhaps a tiny, almost imperceptible growl from your own stomach will remind you just how stark the contrast truly was. You've seen the rare, glittering world of medieval feasts, but let's return to your everyday reality, where food isn't a spectacle, but a struggle. Even when you had something to eat, the way it was prepared, the primitive cooking techniques, added another layer to why medieval food, well, sucked. Forget your fancy ovens, your temperature-controlled stovetops, or your precise measuring tools. Medieval cooking was often smoky, inefficient, and remarkably basic. For most of you, your kitchen was either a designated corner of your single-room hovel or, if you were slightly better off, a separate small structure to prevent house fires. The heart of this kitchen was almost always an open hearth or fire pit. There were no chimneys in many early medieval homes, meaning the smoke from your cooking fire simply filled the room, eventually finding its way out through a hole in the roof or the door. Imagine cooking every meal in a perpetually smoky environment. Your clothes, your hair, your eyes, all constantly stinging from the acrid fumes. It wasn't exactly a pleasant culinary atmosphere. Cooking methods were limited to what could be done over, in, or near an open flame. The most common method was boiling or stewing. Large iron or earthenware pots were suspended over the fire or placed directly into the embers. This is why pottages, gruels, and stews were so prevalent. You could throw in whatever meager ingredients. You had grains, vegetables, a scrap of meat if you were lucky, and let it simmer for hours. It was an efficient way to cook tough cuts of meat, soften hardy vegetables, and make a meal stretch further. It also helped kill some bacteria, though without knowing why. A mainstream historical fact is that boiling was the preferred method for many foods, as it made them more digestible and was a relatively safe way to prepare grains and tough meats. Roasting was largely reserved for the wealthy, who had spits and dedicated hearths, or large fireplaces designed for roasting whole animals or large cuts of meat. For you, roasting a chicken over your small fire might be possible, but it would be a messy, uneven affair, often resulting in charred outsides and undercooked insides, unless you were very skilled. Baking, as we discussed with bread, often happened in communal ovens. If you didn't have access to one, you might bake in an ash pit, where dough was buried directly in hot ashes, or in a Dutch oven-like pot placed in the embers. This could produce surprisingly good results, But again, it required practice and skill. The tools were also incredibly rudimentary. Wooden spoons, knives, basic earthenware pots, and perhaps a cauldron or two were the extent of your kitchen arsenal. There were no precise measurements. Cooking was done by eye, by feel, and by tradition passed down through generations. Recipes, when they existed for the wealthy, were more like guidelines than precise instructions, relying on the cook's intuition. A quirky tidbit is that medieval kitchens often had specialized staff whose sole job was to turn the spits for hours on end, ensuring even cooking. This was not a quick, set-and-forget operation. It was a manual, constant labor. Imagine being the spit boy, endlessly turning a roast, nose to flame, for hours on end. Hygiene, as we'll touch on more deeply, was a huge issue. Your cooking area wasn't spotless. Dirt, dust, flies, and occasional vermin were simply part of the landscape. Without modern soaps and sanitation, keeping cooking utensils and surfaces truly clean was an uphill battle. Historians still argue whether the long cooking times prevalent in medieval cuisine were solely due to the need to tenderize tough ingredients, or if they were also an unconscious defense mechanism against potential contaminants in the food or cooking environment. It's plausible that a longer boil simply made things safer, even if they didn't know the science behind it. So, when you consider how your medieval meal was prepared, it wasn't just the ingredients that sucked. It was the smoke, the limited tools, the guesswork, and the general grittiness of the whole operation. It made every meal a victory, but certainly not a joy of culinary exploration. You've just imagined the smoky, basic nature of medieval cooking. Now, let's talk about a pervasive underlying factor that compounded all the other challenges and made medieval food even more sucky and often outright dangerous. Hygiene. The concept of modern sanitation and germ theory simply didn't exist, and the lack of cleanliness directly impacted everything from food preparation to the safety of what you consumed. Imagine your living conditions. Most people lived in close proximity to their animals. Livestock might be housed in the same building as humans, or just a few steps away. Animal waste was everywhere, from muddy paths to stable floors. Human waste disposal was equally primitive. Outhouses, if they existed, were often rudimentary pits, and frequently, waste was simply thrown into streets, rivers, or fields, especially in denser urban areas. This mainstream historical fact about medieval waste disposal paints a grim picture. For public health, think about that for a moment. The same river you might draw water from, or fish in, could also be a dumping ground for sewage. This pervasive lack of sanitation meant that your food, from the moment it was harvested or slaughtered until it reached your mouth, was constantly vulnerable to contamination. There were no health inspectors, no food safety regulations, no understanding of cross-contamination. Meat might be slaughtered in unsanitary conditions, then left exposed to flies and dust. Grains could be stored in damp, rodent-infested barns. Vegetables and fruits might be grown in soil fertilized with questionable matter, then handled by unwashed hands. Consider the hands that prepared your food. Soap, as we know it, was not widely available or used for routine hand washing, especially by the common person. Water was often scarce or unsafe for washing. So, the hands kneading your bread, chopping your vegetables, or stirring your pottage were likely far from clean. This meant that bacteria, parasites, and viruses could easily transfer from hands to food. You were essentially relying on long cooking times and sheer luck to kill off the pathogens that inevitably found their way into your meal. Even your dining habits were a contributing factor. Eating with hands was common, as forks were a relatively late medieval introduction and a luxury item. While people might rinse their hands, true cleanliness was elusive. Imagine reaching into a communal pot or sharing a trencher with multiple unwashed hands. It wasn't a pretty picture, nor was it particularly hygienic. A quirky tidbit is that medieval table manners, even among the nobility, could seem quite crude by modern standards. For instance, blowing your nose into your hand and then touching communal food was not uncommon. Makes you rethink that potluck, doesn't it? Flies, rodents, and other pests were also a constant presence in medieval homes and kitchens. They would crawl over food, spreading whatever contaminants they carried. There were no screens on windows, no effective pest control methods, so your meal might come with a side of unwelcome guests, or at least the lingering threat of their presence. Historians still argue whether the medieval period saw a higher incidence of certain diseases, like parasitic infections, specifically due to the widespread lack of food and personal hygiene. While specific data is hard to come by, archaeological findings of parasite eggs in ancient latrines and burial sites certainly suggest that intestinal parasites were rampant. So, for you, every meal was not just a quest for calories, but a silent gamble against illness. You might survive the famine, only to succumb to a bad batch of pottage. It really makes you appreciate your local health codes and food safety standards. You've just grappled with the pervasive, invisible threat of poor hygiene in your medieval diet. Now, let's confront the ultimate, horrifying reality that dwarfed all other food-related challenges and could wipe out entire communities: famines. These weren't just periods of scarcity or high food prices. Famines were prolonged, devastating periods of widespread starvation, triggered by crop failures, war, or disease, and they represent the absolute nadir of medieval food experiences. Imagine living in a world where your entire existence hinges on the success of a few crops: wheat, rye, barley. There are no global supply chains to bail you out, no national food reserves, and limited ability to transport food long distances. So, if your local harvest failed, you were quite simply out of luck. A single harsh winter, too much rain, too little rain, or an unforeseen pest infestation could devastate the year's yield. When this happened, it wasn't just a tough year, it was a death sentence for many. This mainstream historical fact about the localized nature of medieval food production and distribution meant that famine was a constant, terrifying possibility for every community. The effects of a famine were brutal and cascading. First, food prices would skyrocket, quickly putting even the most basic sustenance out of reach for the majority of the population. Those with meager savings would quickly exhaust them. Then, people would resort to increasingly desperate measures, eating their seed grains, sacrificing future harvests, slaughtering their precious livestock, eliminating future food sources, and foraging for anything edible: roots, bark, leaves, even desperate measures like eating clay. Imagine gnawing on tree bark just to feel something in your stomach. It's a chilling thought. As hunger deepened, people would weaken, becoming more susceptible to disease. Their immune systems, already compromised by chronic malnutrition, would simply collapse. Diseases like dysentery, typhus, and plague would sweep through the weakened population, often killing more people than starvation itself. People would abandon their homes, desperately seeking food elsewhere, sometimes resorting to begging, theft, or worse. The the social fabric would fray, leading to increased crime and societal breakdown. A quirky tidbit: during some of the worst famines, there are records, though debated, of extreme desperation leading to acts of cannibalism, a horrifying testament to the absolute depths of human suffering. While rare, the mere whisper of such acts highlights the unimaginable pressure of starvation. One of the most infamous examples was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which affected much of northern Europe. A period of unusually heavy rains led to widespread crop failures year after year. The ground became waterlogged, crops rotted in the fields, and livestock succumbed to disease. Millions perished from starvation and the subsequent epidemics. It was a cataclysmic event that fundamentally reshaped societies, demonstrating just how vulnerable medieval Europe was to the whims of nature. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Historians still argue whether the frequency and severity of famines in the High Middle Ages were primarily due to climatic shifts, like the onset of the Little Ice Age, or if population growth outstripping agricultural productivity played a more significant role. It's a complex interplay of factors, but for you, caught in the grip of such an event, the cause didn't matter as much as the agonizing reality. So, as you lay in your comfortable bed tonight, well-fed and secure, take a moment to truly appreciate the stability of your food supply. For your medieval counterpart, the shadow of famine was never far away. A stark reminder that even having bad food was preferable to having no food at all. You've just shuddered at the terrifying prospect of famine, an ever-present shadow over medieval life. But even when the harvests were decent, keeping food from spoiling was a daily, desperate struggle. Without refrigeration, canning, or modern preservatives, preservation in medieval times relied on rudimentary, often inefficient methods that profoundly impacted the taste, texture, and nutritional value of your food. So, while you might escape outright starvation, you often faced a diet of heavily processed, often unappetizing, preserved goods. The most crucial and widespread preservation method was salting. This was particularly vital for meat and fish. Imagine, if you managed to get your hands on some meat, whether from your own pig or a communal slaughter, you had to act fast. Large quantities of salt would be rubbed into the meat or fish, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. The result? Incredibly tough, intensely salty food. While effective at preventing rot, it made eating quite an ordeal. You'd have to soak salted meat for hours, even overnight, to make it somewhat palatable, and even then, it remained chewy and far from fresh. This mainstream historical fact about salt's importance cannot be overstated. It was a commodity so valuable that wars were fought over salt mines and trade routes. Drying was another common method, especially for fruits, vegetables, and sometimes meat. Apples, plums to make prunes, and various herbs could be sun-dried or air-dried, effectively removing moisture and preventing spoilage. Fish, particularly cod and herring, were often split open and dried in the sun or by smoke, turning them into hard, leathery boards that could last for months. You'd then rehydrate these dried foods by soaking and boiling them, a process that inevitably altered their flavor and texture, often rendering them bland and rubbery. Think about the difference between a fresh apple and a dried one. Now imagine that difference for all your fruits and many of your vegetables. Smoking was also used, primarily for meat and fish. Hanging cuts of meat or whole fish over a slow, smoldering fire would impart flavor and, more importantly, create a protective barrier and further dry the food. Bacon, smoked hams, and smoked fish were common, if not universally available, examples. While effective, the smoke flavor would be incredibly strong and pervasive, dominating the taste of the food. A quirky tidbit: some medieval homes had smokehouses built directly into their chimneys, allowing for continuous smoking of meats and cheeses simply by utilizing the household fire. It was an ingenious, if somewhat haphazard, method of turning smoke into a pantry. Fermentation, which we touched upon with ale and cheese, also played a huge role in preservation. Pickling vegetables in brine or vinegar was another option, though vinegar itself could be expensive. Sauerkraut-like fermented cabbage, while not as prevalent across all of Europe as in later periods, was known in some regions. These methods changed the flavor profile dramatically, often making foods sour or pungent, which you would just have to accept as part of the daily diet. Historians still argue whether the heavy reliance on these preservation methods significantly impacted the long-term health of the medieval population, particularly due to high salt intake or the potential loss of vitamins during drying and long cooking. It's hard to quantify, but it's safe to say that your medieval diet, even when preserved, was a far cry from a fresh, balanced meal. So, as you open your fridge or pantry tonight, perhaps pulling out a perfectly fresh fruit or a conveniently packaged meal, remember that for your medieval counterpart, every morsel of preserved food represented a small victory against decay, a testament to ingenuity born of sheer necessity, even if it meant a severely diminished culinary experience. You've just considered the desperate measures medieval people took to preserve their food, making it edible for longer, if not more, appealing. Now, let's widen our gaze and look at another fundamental constraint on your medieval diet trade. In a world without efficient global shipping, refrigerated trucks, or interconnected markets, the availability of food was overwhelmingly determined by what could be grown or produced locally. Limited trade meant limited options, and a diet dictated almost entirely by your immediate. For the vast majority of you, the common folk, your food came from your own fields, your village common land, or perhaps a local market if you lived near a town. You ate what the land provided and what the local climate and soil would support. If your region was good for growing rye, you ate a lot of rye. If it had apple orchards, you ate apples when they were in season. This intensely localized food system is a mainstream historical fact, defining the culinary landscape for centuries. Imagine a world where your grocery store is literally the field outside your door, or a small seasonal gathering in the nearest hamlet. Long-distance trade, while it existed, was slow, expensive, and dangerous. Foodstuffs were bulky and perishable, making them difficult to transport. Moving grain, for instance, required carts or boats, and the journey itself would take weeks or months. Along the way, goods were susceptible to spoilage, theft, and tolls imposed by various lords or towns. This meant that only non-perishable, high-value items could realistically be traded across long distances. This is why spices and sugar, as we've discussed, were so incredibly expensive. Their value was inflated, not just by their rarity at the source, but by the sheer cost and risk of transportation. So, while a wealthy merchant in a port city might occasionally enjoy imported dried figs or a rare citrus fruit, for you, the peasant, such exotic items were utterly unattainable. Your diet was high. Even within a relatively small country, significant regional differences in diet existed based on local agricultural capacity. A quirky tidbit: The diet of someone in, say, mountainous Bavaria would be quite different from someone living on the coast of Flanders, simply due to what could be grown or fished locally and transported cheaply. There was no standard medieval diet across Europe. It was a patchwork of local adaptations. This reliance on local production meant that any local disaster, a flood, a drought, a localized pest outbreak, could have immediate and catastrophic effects on your food supply. There was no vast network to import surplus from another region to compensate for a local shortfall. Even if another region had a surplus, moving it to where it was needed was often logistically impossible or economically unfeasible. This exacerbated the impact of famines, confining them to specific geographical areas rather than allowing for widespread relief. Historians still argue whether the slow development of agricultural techniques in some areas was partly due to the lack of competitive pressure from distant markets, or if it was simply a reflection of technological limitations and a generally stagnant economy. It's hard to say which came first, but the result was clear. Your culinary world was remarkably small, defined by the immediate land around you. So, as you gaze at the incredible variety in your modern kitchen, with ingredients sourced from every corner of the globe, remember that for your medieval counterpart, the world on their plate extended only as far as a good horse-drawn cart could travel in a day or two, if that. It truly makes the term farm-tote take on a whole new, much more literal meaning. You've just considered how limited trade confined your medieval diet to local produce. But even within that local sphere, one factor absolutely overshadowed everything else, determining not just what you ate, but if you ate social class. Your birthright, your position in the feudal hierarchy, was the single most powerful determinant of your food, security, variety, and even your culinary experience. This was a world of stark, undeniable inequality, vividly reflected on every plate. If you were born into the nobility, a lord, a knight, or a high-ranking cleric, your life, culinarily speaking, was a world apart from the peasant masses. You had access to meat regularly, often from hunting on your own vast estates. You enjoyed white bread made from finely milled wheat, a symbol of your elevated status. Spices, sugar, and imported wines, those precious luxuries we discussed, would grace your table, transforming otherwise bland dishes into exotic delights. You'd feast on roasted swans and peacocks, indulge in rich sauces, and command servants to cater to your every whim. Your concern wasn't survival, but display, demonstrating your wealth and power through the lavishness of your table. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval sumptuary laws, though primarily focused on clothing, sometimes extended to food, reinforcing class distinctions and preventing the lower classes from imitating the dietary habits of the elite. Now, shift your gaze to your own reality. You are the vast majority, the peasant. Your life revolved around the land, and your food was directly tied to its yield. You owned little, if any, land yourself. You worked the Lord's land, and in return, you were allowed to cultivate a small strip for your family. Your diet consisted primarily of the coarse grains you grew, rye, barley, oats, made into that ubiquitous, dense bread or thick pottage. Vegetables were hardy root crops or legumes from your small garden plot. Meat was an extremely rare luxury, perhaps a bit of salted pork after a pig slaughter or some wild game you managed to poach at great risk. You drank ale, not wine. Your entire existence was a constant, exhausting struggle to extract enough calories from the earth to survive. The differences weren't just about luxury, they were about fundamental nutrition. The nobility often suffered from gout due to excessive meat and rich foods, or from deficiencies related to a lack of varied vegetables. But for the peasantry, chronic malnutrition was a fact of life. You were constantly on the edge of calorie deficit, your body perpetually working hard just to keep you alive. This often led to stunted growth, lower resistance to disease, and a shorter lifespan. Imagine working dawn till dusk every day on a diet that barely sustains you. It's a level of physical and mental exhaustion that would break most modern individuals. Even the type of food determined your status. White bread for the rich, dark bread for the poor, game meats for the noble, cured offal for the commoner. The very act of eating reinforced the rigid social hierarchy. A quirky tidbit is that even the seating arrangements at a medieval banquet were strictly governed by social class, with the most important guests seated at the high table and everyone else arranged in descending order of status. You knew your place, literally, by where you sat and what was served to you. Historians still argue whether the extreme dietary disparities between classes led to significant differences in physical stature and health outcomes, beyond what can be explained by disease and labor alone. While hard data is scarce, skeletal remains from medieval burial sites often show clear distinctions in health indicators between those from wealthy and poor graves. For you, the peasant, your social class didn't just determine your wardrobe or your dwelling. It determined whether your stomach felt full, whether you had the energy to get through the day, and ultimately, how long you would live. It was the ultimate culinary lottery, and most of you drew the short straw. You've absorbed the harsh reality of medieval class distinction, where your plate was a literal representation of your place in society. Now, let's consider something more subtle, yet equally profound. That would make medieval food a shock to your system: taste. Your modern palate, accustomed to a global array of flavors, refined sugars, and precise seasoning, would find medieval cuisine not just bland or unusual, but often actively unappealing. Imagine stripping away almost everything you consider delicious. No refined sugar, as we've discussed, meaning sweetness was mostly from earthy honey or the occasional ripe fruit. No intense, concentrated flavors from modern cooking techniques. No perfectly balanced spices, only the occasional heavy hand if you were wealthy, or local herbs if you were not. Your taste buds, conditioned to the culinary fireworks of the 21st century, would be in for a rude awakening. Medieval food was often characterized by a strong emphasis on sour and savory flavors. Vinegar, verjuice, the highly acidic juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, and fermented ingredients were common, adding a sharp, sometimes aggressive temperature to dishes. This wasn't just for flavor. These acidic elements also helped cut through the richness of fatty meats, if you were lucky enough to have them, and aided in preservation. Imagine a stew, thick with grain, with a distinct sour kick from verjuice. It's certainly a unique experience, far from the umami-rich balanced flavors we crave today. The cooking methods themselves also influence taste. Long boiling times, as we discussed, would often leach out delicate flavors and leave vegetables soft and mushy. Smoking and heavy salting, while preserving food, imparted dominant, often overpowering flavors that masked the natural taste of the ingredients. Your medieval self would be entirely accustomed to these strong, often one-note flavors, but your modern self would likely recoil. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval recipes, particularly for the elite, often mixed sweet and savory elements in ways that seem unusual to us today, such as adding fruit to meat dishes or honey to stews. While not always common, For the peasantry, this blending of flavors highlights a different culinary sensibility. Texture was another huge factor. Forget crisp vegetables or tender meats. Your bread was dense and hard. Your vegetables were likely boiled to oblivion. Your meats, when available, were often tough, stringy, or heavily cured and chewy. There was little emphasis on the varied textures that make modern food enjoyable. Every bite was an exercise in mastication. A quirky tidbit: the ideal texture for some medieval dishes was actually a soft, easily digestible mush or paste, as it was thought to be healthier and easier for the body to process. So, your modern aversion to mush would be seen as rather unsophisticated. This difference in palate isn't just about ingredients. It's about a fundamentally different appreciation of food. What tasted good in medieval times was often what was filling, safe, and nutritious enough to survive. Flavor was secondary, and sophistication was often defined by rarity and expense rather than nuanced culinary technique. Historians still argue whether the medieval palate was truly less discerning than the modern one, or if it was simply adapted to the severe limitations and prevailing medical theories of the time. It's difficult to truly taste through the centuries, but the evidence suggests a very different sensory experience. So, as you savor your next meal, whatever its flavors, remember that your tongue has been trained by centuries of culinary evolution, a luxury your medieval counterpart could only dream of. You've just wrestled with the stark differences in taste and texture, realizing your modern palate would be utterly bewildered by medieval cuisine. Now, let's consider perhaps the slowest moving aspect of medieval food that directly contributed to its overall suckiness: innovation. For centuries, agricultural and culinary advancements moved at a glacial pace. There were no sudden revolutions, no widespread adoption of new technologies, and certainly no food bloggers inventing new recipes every week. Progress was slow, incremental, and often localized, meaning your diet remained largely unchanged for generations. Think about the tools and techniques. The basic plow, while vital, evolved slowly. Crop rotation systems were understood, but their implementation varied widely and wasn't always optimized. The development of new plant varieties, which in modern times happens rapidly through selective breeding, was a slow, almost accidental process in the Middle Ages. You were growing pretty much the same grains, the same root vegetables, and raising the same livestock as your grandparents, and likely your great-grandparents. There was little incentive or capacity for widespread experimentation. This lack of rapid technological advancement in food production and preparation is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the static nature of the medieval diet. There were some small advancements, of course. The widespread adoption of the heavy plow in northern Europe, capable of turning the denser soils, allowed for more productive farming in certain regions. The development of watermills and windmills made the arduous task of grinding grains slightly less labor-intensive, though still often a communal, fee-based service. New crops, like certain types of beans or peas, might slowly spread from one region to another, enriching the diet in isolated pockets. But these were often slow diffusions, taking decades or even centuries to become widely adopted. Consider the role of knowledge. Scientific understanding of soil, fertility, plant diseases, or animal husbandry was rudimentary at best. Farming practices were largely based on tradition, folklore, and observation. If a method worked, it was continued. If it failed, it was abandoned, but the underlying scientific reasons were unknown. There were no agricultural universities or research institutes. Knowledge was often passed down orally, generation to generation, leading to pockets of expertise, but not widespread, systematic improvement. A quirky tidbit is that medieval agricultural manuals, when they existed, often contained a mix of practical advice, superstitions, and astrological influences on planting and harvesting. Imagine consulting a farming guide that tells you the best time to sow seeds is when the moon is in a particular constellation. The economic and social structures also stifled innovation. As a peasant, you had little surplus, little capital, and little incentive to experiment with new crops or techniques that might fail and jeopardize your family's survival. If a new method promised higher yields but required significant investment or carried a high risk, it was simply not an option for you. The feudal system, with its rigid social hierarchy and focus on tradition, also discouraged radical change. Why would a lord invest in risky agricultural innovation when the current system, however inefficient, still extracted enough labor and produce from his peasants? Historians still argue whether the apparent stagnation in agricultural and culinary innovation during the Middle Ages was primarily due to a lack of scientific inquiry, or if it was a rational adaptation to a low-tech, high-risk environment where stability and predictability were valued over experimental progress. It's a chicken and egg question, but for you, the consequence was clear. Your diet was stuck in a rut. You ate what had always been eaten, prepared in much the same way it had always been prepared. So, as you scroll through countless new recipes, or consider the latest kitchen gadget, remember that your medieval counterpart was likely eating the same meal their great-grandparents ate, with virtually no culinary breakthroughs to look forward to. It was a long, slow grind. Section 20. You've witnessed a painfully slow march of innovation. Or rather, its near standstill in medieval food. Now, let's bring it all together for the final, overarching truth about why food truly sucked in medieval times. It was a daily struggle for survival. Every single aspect of your culinary life, from what little you ate to how it was prepared, was fundamentally shaped by the constant, relentless battle simply to put something, anything, in your stomach and stay alive. Imagine waking up and the first thought isn't what you want to eat, but what you can eat, or perhaps more accurately, what you might eat today. Your hunger isn't just a fleeting pang. It's a constant dull ache, punctuated by moments of intense craving or the sickening dread of an empty larder. Food isn't a source of pleasure or even comfort. It's fuel, and a desperately scarce one at that. Your body is a machine, and you are constantly trying to feed it just enough to keep it running, knowing that a single bad harvest, a single illness, or a single misstep could plunge you into the terrifying abyss of true starvation. This existential struggle is the mainstream, historical fact that underlines all others. Every decision you make throughout your day, as a peasant, is influenced by food. Your work in the fields is driven by the need to grow sustenance. Your trade in the market, if you have anything to trade, is often for basic foodstuffs. Your interactions with your Lord are colored by the power he holds over your land and its yield. You are, quite literally, living to eat, not eating to live. And the odds are constantly stacked against you. The quality of your life, measured by your energy levels, your health, and your very lifespan, was directly tied to this precarious food supply. You were likely smaller, weaker, and more susceptible to disease than your modern counterpart. Malnutrition, not just acute starvation during famines, was a chronic condition for many. It affected your ability to work, your immune system, and even your cognitive function. Imagine trying to think clearly or feel hopeful when your body is constantly crying out for calories. A quirky tidbit is that archaeological studies of medieval skeletons often reveal signs of childhood malnutrition, such as enamel hyperplasia, defects in tooth enamel, showing that the struggle began from a very young age. Your early years were likely marked by perpetual hunger, scarring you for life. There was no safety net, no government programs, no food banks, no charity on a scale large enough to mitigate widespread hunger. If your crops failed, if you lost your livelihood, or if disease struck your family, you were largely on your own. The community might offer some limited support, but ultimately, survival was a brutal, individual fight. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was a time of consistent undernourishment for the majority, or if there were cyclical periods of greater abundance, punctuated by extreme scarcity. While it likely varied by region and specific decades, the prevailing narrative is one of a population constantly on the edge, where food security was a fragile, hard-won victory. For you, it meant that peace of mind was as rare as a sweet dessert. As you conclude this journey through the culinary struggles of the past, remember that the simple act of choosing what to eat, or knowing that food will be there tomorrow, is a profound luxury. The medieval person faced a diet that was monotonous, often unsafe, limited by season and class, prepared crudely, and constantly threatened by disease and famine. It was a testament to human resilience, but also a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability when basic needs are so precariously met.